and thank you all for putting up with me this morning. Just so you know, I don't preach anything like Russ. Russ is like up here. The bar has to come considerably down so I can just barely step over it. And I think Russ is going to have some fun when he watches this later. I'm an executive. You're live streaming me. So you don't really want to grow your church, do you? Okay? You need to listen to this sermon just a little bit. You like oh boy. As an executive pastor, much of what I do is about the church, the organization itself. How, we executive pastors tend to think about how the church itself functions. Is the heating and air efficient? Is there money in the bank? Are we complying with all the IRS rules, the state of Colorado rules, so on and so forth? But I've gotten real fascinated over the years with the church itself and the church as an organization. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit this morning about the church. And I'd like to start in the Gospel of John. In this section of John, Jesus has gone off and he's praying. This is right before Judas is going to turn him over to the Roman authorities. But there's one part of this prayer that to me is particularly meaningful for all of us that are in the church. Beginning in verse 15, he is praying for the unity of all believers. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. Most of us in the church today, whether we're in Broomfield or whether we're in Denver or whether we're in Wheat Ridge, want to be in a growing church. We want growth. We want healthy congregations that love being together, love getting along with each other. And more importantly, we want sustainability. We want to think that today, this church where you're sitting now, 40, 50 years from now, that some part of this congregation is still here, right? Recently, I came across a study done by the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention, as many of you know, is the largest Protestant denomination in the world. And they have the resources to really think about how they're doing in domestic missions and foreign missions. And one of the things they've gotten very interested in is churches that are in decline, churches that are failing, churches that are falling away and closing their doors. And the Southern Baptists recently have estimated that on average, 17 of their churches will close every single week. Now think about that for a moment. That's one denomination. That's one denomination that has taken time to study that. Think of all the other denominations and all the other independent churches that don't have the resources to do that. I think it would be optimistic to say that there's only going to be 25 to 30 churches a week closing in the United States. That means 25 or 30 communities losing They're light for the gospel each and every week. There's been a lot of work done, particularly in the last few years. How does the modern church stem this tide? Traditionally, the argument has always been we need programs. We need climbing walls in our children's area. We need swimming pools. We need who knows what else we need. And so budgets are written and fundraisers are done, and we are going after what has come to be called the consumer Christian. This is, your preacher is better, I'm going to go there. I like the music better over here. There's a climbing wall for my kid over there. But the reality of it is, programs are not really ultimately what will sustain and grow the church. And first and foremost, and we don't have time to really unpack all this today, but the church is built to grow. That is the plan of God, that your church right here today on Sheridan is to grow. It's not to stay the same. It's not to decline. The master celestial God-breathed plan for this church is growth. My church, Crossroads Church of Denver, the plan is to grow. There is no plan anywhere in Scripture that says start a church and let it wither away. But the plan is also not to do this necessarily with a lot of programmatic features. But we have come to live in an age where superficial is becoming more and more the norm, because we in the church want to attract people, and we think that the way to do that is through all of these things, and we bypass something else that's essentially more fundamental, and that is relationships. Relationships with each other, relationships especially with those that are not here yet. Now, I love programs. I do. I had the privilege at a previous church to start an Upward sports league for kids. And if you're not familiar with Upward, it's league basketball, it's league soccer, and if you have the space for it, it's league flag football. But it's all based around a gospel message. And it's all designed to be non-competitive. And one of the great joys with doing that is you are hopefully attracting kids from all over the community that are coming, and they are being exposed to the gospel. I had the privilege during one of our camps one time having two little Hindu girls pray to Jesus with their friends. So programs are important, but I want to stress programs easily trump something that I think is harder to do. Now, I'm going to step outside my pre-planned box a little bit this morning because I happened to see this. This is a We Need You card. I'm sure everybody has seen one. Hopefully, everyone in the room has signed up for something on this. The first church that I served in Colorado was a church that had 45 people on staff. 45. Sometimes, especially with the interns were coming in and out before we even knew who they were. I mean, it was a church culture that was built on staff. Everybody is paid to do everything from make coffee to clean the restrooms to preach to everything. Everything was paid staff. My current church, we have gone absolutely the opposite direction. Virtually every single thing we do is volunteer-led. Now, I am, if you haven't been able to tell yet, I am a refugee from Atlanta, Georgia. I came out here in 2006. My first role in this church with 45 staff was as facilities director. And then they couldn't think of anything else to do, so they gave me more things to do over time. But where I'm at right now, I am privileged to serve with a couple of volunteers that have forgotten more about how to maintain buildings and property than I ever knew. And I can tell you, it's a model that I never, ever, ever want to go back to. because you will have opportunities in the future to invest in ministry, to invest in outreach, to invest, like the shoe drive that's going on right now. You're going to have an opportunity to really spread your ministry wings over time, and you can choose to do that through volunteers, or you can choose to do that through channeling some of that money into staff that oftentimes volunteers can do themselves. Plus, as I'm talking about relationships this morning, one of the great things we've seen at Crossroads is a large part of our small group ministry are these volunteer teams. And it's an amazing thing. So forgive me for the commercial, Randy, but I saw this and I just had to talk about it. And that makes the message this morning, instead of being only an hour, it's going to make it like an hour and 15. I'm just kidding. In looking at what the church is supposed to look like, there is no better example than the second chapter of Acts. In the second chapter of Acts, we've had the day of Pentecost. Peter has preached his sermon. And now we're talking about the church. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. The critical element in the early church, and the early church obviously is experiencing incredible growth, was they loved each other. They were in relationship with each other. And they loved the people that were not in their fellowship yet. And their love and their relationships were so strong that the people that were not part of that group marveled at it. But today we live in a different age. Recently, I came across a book written by a pastor in North Carolina called James Emery White. And he has written a book called Rise of the Nuns. Now, before you think that there is a sudden uprising of Catholic women in habits, this is the word nun. We had to put it up on the screen because if you can't get through some of my Southern, it does sound that way. What nun means is these are people, when asked about their religious preferences, they have none. None. When I was growing up, it was common if someone said, "You believe in God?" You'd say, "Well, I'm a Methodist." Or, "What do you believe?" "Well, I'm Christian," or "I'm Baptist," or "I'm Catholic," or whatever. Or at least you would say, "I'm Hindu," or "I'm Buddhist." In 1940, 5% of the American population was none. So they're atheists, agnostics, or just don't care one way or the other. In 1990, that percentage was 8.1%. So in 50 years, it's climbed 3.1% of the population. In 2008, it's 15%. They did the study again 4 years later in 2012, and it's at 19.3%. So essentially, 20% currently or more of the American population is a nun. They have no religion whatsoever. They may have vague beliefs about God, but the reality of being a nun is they don't think enough about God whatsoever to think about whether they really believe in him or not. And the burden, ladies and gentlemen, for so much of this is our own churches. We have been trying over the years to answer basic and fundamental needs through programs, and we've kind of ignored this concept of what does real relationship look like in our church, in our community, and in our workplace. A few years ago, there was a group of 21 churches that were essentially in the Arvada area that wanted to get together and see what they could do for the community. How can these churches come together, work together, and support one another for, some wonderful thing that the community needs? And after a lot of meetings, they finally had one with the mayor where he said, well, what we need more than anything else, and this is true, and he said this is true of many of my counterparts throughout the country, what we need more than anything else is a neighboring program. Now, at the time, these pastors were kind of scratching their heads saying, what does that look like? But these government leaders, and there's been a lot of studies that have suggested the same thing, have said that people who have close bonds with their neighbors live longer. When people know the names of their neighbors, crime can be upwards of 60% less. When natural disasters strike, your neighbors are your first responders. And ladies and gentlemen, there's no visible difference between the Christian neighbor and the non-Christian neighbor. So if everyone is our neighbor, we're beginning to reach at everyone else. Now, my next text this morning is a story that I think is familiar to all of you. And it's one most of us have grown up with. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. And it begins in the 10th chapter of Luke in the 25th verse. And this is what scholars call a double love command. And so if you read all the way through this, you'll see that one parable ends and a story begins. Reading from the 25th verse. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked, Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now, all of us are familiar with the story. Jesus goes from here to define the neighbor by telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. Samaritan's on the road, robbers attack him, beat him, rob him, leave him there half dead. First person that comes down the road is a priest. He intentionally walks on the other side and looks dead ahead so he's not going to notice this guy over here. A little while later, a Levite does the same thing, crosses over to the other side. Finally, a Samaritan comes by, and as I'm sure you've heard before, Samaritans and Jews do not get along. So Jesus using a Samaritan in this is very telling. The Samaritan stops. He helps the guy that is beaten and near death. Then he puts the Samaritan on his own donkey, takes him to an inn, pays for him to receive care, tells the innkeeper, if you spend more than the 2 denarii I'm giving you, I will be back and I will reimburse you for the difference. So when Jesus is asked in Scripture, who is my neighbor? It's very telling. Essentially, our neighbor is everyone we come in contact with. But it's first and foremost, it's our literal neighbors. So what these pastors did, and they were led by one pastor in particular named Dave Runyon, what they did is they developed a neighboring program. And they've used it, and it's been used in a lot of churches throughout the country by now. But it starts with a very simple idea. Figure out the 8 people that live nearest to you And if you can write their names on little squares, then okay, you're doing pretty good. But if you can't name the 8 households near you, whether on your cul-de-sac or in your neighborhood or in your apartment community or in your condominium complex, then maybe it's time to start introducing ourselves. You know, learning a name is a great first step. Now, I've met a lot of nice people here this morning, and I wish I could tell you that if I come back 6 months from now, I would remember all the names. And it's not my old age that's done that. I've always been like that. So I have to meet people several times, and I have to get over this thing. I even told a nice gentleman this morning, I said, I'm sorry I met you earlier, and I don't remember your name already. And then Randy, to be helpful, he said, that's Herb. I said, okay, thank you. So I repeat Herb several times, which sounds like a pretty good strategy, doesn't it? The only problem with that is his name is actually Marv. But by learning names, we get an opportunity, a wonderful opportunity to go beyond, hey, good to see you this morning. Hey, what's up? What's up? Nice to see you. We get to go from that to, hey, Randy, how's it going? And we get to go from, hey, Randy, how's it going, to ultimately caring how it is going for Randy. We begin to connect. We're connecting with them. They're connecting with us. In Acts chapter 17, Paul has gone to Athens. And in Athens, Athens is an incredibly religious place, but it's Greek religion. It is many gods, many types of sacrifices, and to the point that if you take the time to read the 17th chapter, you'll find that Paul even notices there is an altar to the unknown God. So none of these guys are nuns. They all have something. They just don't have the right something. And they've invited Paul to talk to him. Beginning in verse 26, he's talking about, from one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. And the implication of this is we are all living where we live purposefully. And I know what you're thinking. Of course I lived there on purpose. I bought the house. I rented the apartment. I got that great RV. I am living where I'm living on purpose. But there's another purpose there. Who are the people that we are living with and around all the time that through the busyness of our own lives, we're just not seeing them anymore? What is God? What can he do? What will he do? What is he wanting to do through this group of people and through our relationships that we have the opportunity to build right where we live? If we were to follow this great commandment of loving your neighbor, how would it change that neighborhood for you? How would it change our community? How would it change our churches? I know, the big question is, how am I going to have time for one more relationship, especially several more with these neighbors? I've gotten this far with just waving and hollering, hey, how's it going? How you want me to care about them? Time is the biggest obstacle we need to overcome to be effective neighbors. Are we living at a pace that allows us to be available to those around us? And I can answer only for myself, and no, I am not. No, I am not. You know, technology, and I'm old enough that I remember the first PCs. You know, remember in the late 70s, early 80s, PCs are coming out. And as all of us started to add computers to our home, you know, the big thing then was, this is going to save a lot of time. Think of all the things we can do. And I remember I had this word processor for our business at the time, and this thing was like this big, this wide, and had a goofy little monitor over here. And you remember the floppy disks, the 5 1/4, and you had to load it up with that. And it was brutally expensive, but what it would do was a crude form of spell check. What we take for granted now, it sort of tried to do. And then in the 90s, cell phones come out. And cell phones were going to be a major leap in personal productivity. I remember, my son cringes when I say this, I remember my first cell phone. Oh, Dad, you're too old. It was about this big, had an antenna that came out of it, cost $800. Now, it's one thing to spend $800 now for a smartphone that you can pay for your coffee at Starbucks with, surf the internet, get directions to Fargo, North Dakota. That's one thing. This was a phone. All this thing did was make calls. But all of these steps were intended to give us margin. And it hadn't happened. At least it hadn't happened for me. We tend to fall into this trap sometime, somewhere, somehow, a month from now, 2 months from now, things are going to settle down. I'm going to have more time with my family. I'm going to have more time to train my dog. I'm going to have time for vacation. But I don't seem to really get there. More will be enough when I finally get this other monitor or this newer TV, because now they've come out with the curved ones. I'm thinking I'd probably like to have that. But that's not gonna give me more margin. In fact, I can tell you right now, in my household, that curved TV is going to take margin away. Can you imagine how all those balls look on that curve? Okay. So we are constantly, as a people, avoiding something that you and I and each one of us in here is fundamentally wired for: relationships. That's what we're wired for. After the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus goes into a house. He's invited into a house. And there's 2 sisters in the house. And I think you know the story. It begins in Luke 10, verse 38. And Jesus and his disciples were on their way. He came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things. But few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Martha was distracted by making preparations to host Jesus. By being distracted, she is actually missing out on time with Jesus. She is rushed and misses the main thing, even though she is doing a lot of good things. What Martha was doing wasn't bad. But Jesus essentially is reprimanding her for serving him. Jesus is saying to her then and to us now that we need at times to say no to this vast collection of good things so that we have time for the things that are really important, especially the main thing in our life. Mary, on the other hand, violating every cultural norm she can possibly violate, is sitting at the feet of Jesus. This is not something that this wouldn't have gone over well. She's sitting at the feet with Jesus, with the men. She's not helping her sister Martha, but she's willing to step outside of that cultural box to focus on what is really important. Sometimes we need to go against the cultural norms. Sometimes we have to intentionally create space for relationship with our neighbors, for our relationships at our children's schools, for the relationship with the barista that we see 4 times a week at Starbucks, and most especially for the relationships that you have right here in your church family. In a day when churches are dying, ladies and gentlemen, in a day when the number of people not only don't believe in God, but worse, don't care if there is one or not, relationships matter. Your church is built to grow. All churches are. But you know, coming from the South, there are churches in the Deep South that have been churches for over 200 years. I can take you to a church in a place called Rome, Georgia, where the elders for the last 150 years have carefully taken care of bullet holes in the side of the church produced by a clash between the Union Army and the Confederate Army. But I can also take you to churches in the Deep South that have died. And truly, I can find many of them right here in Denver. So if we are going to make margin in our own lives, let us think for a moment about what is really important to us and perhaps begin to practice the art of eliminating something. Richard Foster wrote once, in contemporary society, our adversary majors in 3 things: noise, hurry, and crowds. If he can keep us engaged in muchness and manyness, he will rest satisfied. Hurry is not of the devil. It is the devil. Jesus had a healthy rhythm in his life. People always wanted more of him, but he also knew when to retreat. If you read all of Scripture, it becomes pretty clear that Jesus did not heal everyone. Jesus did not talk to everyone. Jesus did not do a miracle of loaves and fishes every time a crowd gathered. Maybe God is calling each of us to give up something so that we can make room for something that is far more vitally important. And I think it's natural at this point. You know, we think that's really hard to meet people. It's really hard for me because first of all, I'm an introvert by nature. Second of all, my natural proclivity is shyness. My shyness is so bad that when my wife and I married, I was actually in politics at the time, and so when you're in politics, you have to go into lots of groups of people all the time and meet them. You have to shake their hands, look them in the eye, learn to remember what their daughter's name is and how their dog is doing. This is just part of the turf. I would almost break out in hives every time I had to do that. Well, when my wife and I got married, she was real good at doing that. And so we were kind of an interesting couple going into any of these gatherings because she would go ahead of me and I would kind of follow behind like this weird trailer thing that she's got going. And she would come up and she would meet you, she would engage you, talk with you for a minute, and then say, "Have you met my husband, Hunter?" And it made it easy for me to do it. And I learned over the years, I got a little bit better at doing it because it dawned on me at some point in time, my wife cannot always be with me. So what am I going to do? Well, years later, I had the privilege of working with a senior pastor at Cherry Creek. Brad is an over-the-top extrovert. He's an extrovert to the point that if he's, God help you if you happen to stand in the DMV line with Brad Strait, because in about 15 minutes, he's going to know your entire life story, and he will genuinely be interested in it. Brad is the type of guy that will walk through the halls singing at odd times, and he just loves people. And so for me, it's been something that I've kind of had to grow into, but I really love at this point, and I say this as an introvert because I'm still an introvert, I love to engage with people. And I heartily recommend that if you're uncomfortable with it, just start to try because it is what we are called to do. It is how we grow as Christians in community. It is how our churches grow. It is how our communities become stronger. And it is the only thing that is going to effectively resolve the two great issues in the American church today, the rise of the nuns and the death of our congregations throughout this country. In Luke 7, Jesus has been invited by a Pharisee to come in and talk. Jesus goes in and they have dinner. And as customary in the first century, you don't sit at a table. You literally recline in front of it. So it's kind of like laying down to watch TV, some kind of way. How you eat that way, I have no clue. But anyway, that's kind of what they did. While this is going on and the Pharisee Simon is talking to Jesus and wanting to learn from him, a woman of sin, who knows what the sin is, but it's clear it is a woman of sin, comes in and starts to minister to Jesus. She's crying. She is washing his feet with her hair. She is covering his feet with perfume. Simon is thinking to himself, this guy is not much of a prophet if he does not know what kind of woman this is. Jesus responds with something that I hope all of us will remember in the weeks ahead. He turns to Simon and says, "Do you see this woman?" And then he tells Simon what's really going on here, and then he forgives the woman's sin because of her faith. But the critical part here is, do you see this woman? Because in our age, in all our busyness, it is so easy to overlook the people that are right in front of us. I'm supposed to say worship band. Uniquely, if we follow this great commandment of loving our neighbors, it has the potential to change our neighborhoods, but it is also going to change us. I like me better not being shy. I do. I like me better, and I used to kid Brad. I said, Brad, I feel like I'm becoming a Brad mini-me because I stopped short of singing in the halls. But the more I met people, the more God showed me how much I loved people. So loving our neighbors is going to help change us, our relationships, our communities, and our church. And that is how we begin to fulfill that great commission in the first chapter of Acts. That is when we do become the witnesses to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for putting up with me this morning.